about 90.
The theme of this conference is strategy and leadership in the Middle East. Now, in his recent trip to Asia, President Obama gave us great material to use as a jumping-off point. And so, as they say on the sports shows on ESPN, let's go straight to the videotape.
The point is that for some reason, many who were proponents of what I consider to be a disastrous decision to go into Iraq haven't really learned the lesson of the last decade. And they keep on just playing the same note over and over again. Why? I don't know. But my job as Commander-in-Chief is to look at what is it that is going to advance our security interests over the long term, to keep our military in reserve for where we absolutely need it. There are going to be times where there are disasters and difficulties and challenges all around the world, and not all of those are going to be immediately solvable by us. But we can continue to speak out clearly about what we believe, where we can make a difference using all the tools we've got in the toolkit. We should do so. And if there are occasions where targeted, clear actions can be taken that would make a difference, then we should take them. We don't do them because somebody's sitting in an office in Washington or New York think it would look strong. That's not how we make foreign policy. And if you look at the results of what we've done over the last 5 years, it is fair to say that our alliances are stronger, our partnerships are stronger, and in the Asia-Pacific region, just to take one example, we are much better positioned to work with the peoples here on a whole range of issues of mutual interest. And that may not always be sexy. That may not always attract a lot of attention, and it doesn't make for good argument on Sunday morning shows. But it avoids errors. You hit singles, you hit doubles. Every once in a while, we may be able to hit a home run, but we steadily advance the interests of the American people and our partnership with folks around the world.
Friends, reaction. Senator Kaine.
Well, you know, American strength is, you have to look at it in sort of four spectrums: military strength, diplomatic strength, strength of our moral example, economic strength. And you have to balance all those areas of strength. I've been in the Senate for about a year and a half, and here's the way I look at this now. We are trying to balance all those areas of strength. The one notable change, I think, in American policymaking right now, and I'll just use the experience of being on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we had to cast a vote about whether to use military force to punish Bashar al-Assad for use of chemical weapons against civilians. It was a very narrowly divided vote. I voted for use of military force in that circumstance and was proud to and would vote the same way again, but it was a 10-8 vote. If it had gone to the floor of the Senate, it might have passed, but it would have been very close. It would definitely have failed in the House. Absolutely would have failed. I think a major change in our policy in the last few years is less willingness to use military strength unilaterally. I think if you look at how we're doing on trade and commerce and foreign direct investment, we are very strong. If you look at it, how deeply engaged we are in diplomacy, not always working out the way we want, but in terms of a vigorous engagement, and we're strong. I think we are strong in our moral example, but we are less willing to use military force unilaterally, to some degree to my regret in this Syria instance. But I think the reason for that lessening of willingness to use military force unilaterally is 13 years of war. It's what our public is telling us. When I voted to use military force in Syria, the calls coming into the office were about 90-10 against. And when I mentioned that to Senator Angus King, I said, boy, my calls were 90-10 against. He said, man, Virginia really is pro-military. My calls were 1,000-1 against. So it's 13 years of war. It's American public reaction. It is congressional reaction in the House. Overwhelmingly, they would have opposed military action. Even those who were talking tough, why isn't the president willing to do more, when the issue on the table was, will you vote to use military force to uphold an important international norm? The answer was no. And finally, in Congress, there's a lack of willingness to pay for stuff. We've imposed a sequester that is having very significant effect on the defense budget of this country and on non-defense items as well. When the sequester was voted on and put in place in August of 2011, everybody said, don't worry, we're not going to do this. We're not going to force these defense cuts to happen. We're going to find a bigger budget deal. But when no budget deal was found, folks have willingly allowed the sequester to really hurt our ability to spend militarily in what we would need to do to maybe project stronger on the unilateral military side. So I would just say my reaction is we got to balance military, diplomatic, economic, strength of our moral example. But on the military side, we are much more prone now to look for partners for multilateral action and to be resistant to unilateral action. I don't always agree with that, but that is the temperature of the folks up on the Hill right now.
Elliott, your view?
Well, I think what's missing in the president's account is the word leadership. Senator Kaine had 9-to-1 calls coming in and saying, don't do this, it's not right. And he said, no, it is right, and that's the way I'm going to vote, because I think that's in the interest of the country. I think that's the kind of leadership that's missing. In my conversations with administration people, I tend to hear too much about, well, the polls were 80-20 or 90-10, therefore we couldn't do it. But there's no therefore there. If, the president mentioned there are people in Washington sitting in offices and in New York saying, do this. Who are those people? Hillary Clinton, Leon Panetta, Robert Gates. Those are the people who told him to do more in Syria. His people, not think tank guys, not former officials, not Republicans. His top advisors told him we need to do more in Syria, and he wouldn't do it. And I just say one other thing, which is really very unfortunate, and it was pointed out by Samantha Power in her speech at the Holocaust Museum dinner. It is wrong to argue that the choice is between war and doing nothing, which is essentially what the president said. He talked about troops. No one was talking about troops when it came to Syria. It was a one-night strike, an airstrike. So the argument that, we have to choose between doing nothing or it's another Iraq, it's another 10 years, and it's another 100,000 men, and it's another $1 trillion, that's a false argument. And the president should not be making that argument because it feeds isolationism. And he should be trying to help all of us defeat isolationism.
Jim, your view.
I don't know if this is on. Yeah. So I hope this isn't going to be and I certainly don't see it as a repeat of the old Saturday Night Live routine in which we have two sides going after each other, because there are many of what Elliott just said. I share his views, especially the importance of leadership. But I want to focus on one observation the president made about how some of the problems that we face now are not immediately solvable by the United States. And I think that's an important lesson in caution. I think we need to understand there's a kind of a demand for instant gratification in dealing with some very complex and long-term trends that we're dealing with here. I thought Steve's introduction to this panel was terrific because he really laid out the fact that we are dealing with some huge changes in terms of economics and social change and political changes that are not susceptible to single answers or immediate solutions. But I think there's also a flip side to that, and I'd like to hear that emphasized as well, which is that even if we can't have immediate solutions to problems like democratic change in Egypt and the like, that we have to have a clear vision and a long-term strategy that identifies where we'd like to get to and how we shape the environment in which those things take place. And I think that part of the challenge we face right now is that there is, for better or for worse, and whether it's fair or not, a certain degree of uncertainty in the world, and certainly in this region about what we see as our long-term goals and objectives and what our long-term strategy is to deal with it. It's hard to do in a time of great change and uncertainty. It's easy to have a strategy when the outlines are very clear. But I think it's important now that we begin to shape an environment in which the near term is very uncertain, and our ability to foster a stable, pluralist Egypt is a challenge. We have limited tools, but we also need to find ways to make clear where we want to get to, how we use our engagement with countries in the region, with peoples in the region, with our own economic, diplomatic, and military tools to identify what really matters to the United States and how we want to work with the people in the Middle East and elsewhere to get to that point.
Okay, thank you. And Jean-David, as an intimate observer, but with an outside view, when you hear this debate and when you hear and see the president, what is your reaction? And you don't have to speak for all of Europe. It's Jean-David Levitte's view.
Yes. Well, Rob, thank you very much first for the invitation. I have fond memories from my years in Washington during the challenging days of the Freedom Fries. Now, I start with the word used by Elliott, that is leadership. We live in a global world, but we need a pilot for globalization. And this pilot, in my view, can be only America. Of course, you have regional powers emerging fast, China, India, Brazil. They want more rights, but no more responsibilities, especially in the difficult spots of the world. And for Russia, it's more of a power to say no than to build solutions. And so what is left is America. And if we don't have American leadership showing the way to solutions, then we are in a very difficult situation. Of course, as Jim said, we are in a new world, and you need, for each difficulty, to build a coalition of the willing. Leadership is not to act alone, is to act with your friends and allies. But let's take, for instance, the peace process between the Israeli and the Palestinians. America will be blamed either because you don't act or because you act and you don't succeed. But it's better to be blamed because you try, at least, to bring a solution. And so I'm very much in favor of an engaged America leading the way towards a better world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Now that we've gone beyond the general question about strategy and leadership, let's look at some of the specific items on the policy agenda. And let's begin with what I believe is fair to say is the top priority for the president in this part of the world, which is his pledge to prevent Iran from developing or acquiring a nuclear weapon. Sanctions backed by the threat of force were designed to convince Iran to come to the table. Iran has come to the table. We're nearing the critical moment of whether there is an agreement in the first 6 months of negotiations. So, gentlemen, what would a good deal, or at least an acceptable deal, look like? And what do you think the chances of that happening really are? Senator, I'll start with you, but we'll shift around the order a bit. Senator?
Well, a good deal would have a couple of components. And the Senate, 82 of us have written a letter to the President saying, here's what we think the components are. And the President and his team should take this seriously, because any deal would have to, that involves the relaxation of congressionally mandated sanctions has to come back to Congress. And so when 82 senators have written and said, here's what we think a good deal is, and there's an equivalent number on the House, percentage-wise, that have written, should take this pretty seriously. First, a very complex and comprehensive inspections regime. That has to be sort of 24/7, 365 anywhere. There has to be an inspections regime that is very robust, because that's what gives us, the deal may be today, but what about 5 years from now? What about 10 years from now? We have to have the ability to check and see if there's a change in intention. Second, a dismantling of not only the inability, Iran should not just not have a weapon, but we need to dismantle so much of the program in Iran that it is very clear that any equipment that they have is not sufficient to develop a nuclear weapon. Are there civilian uses of nuclear power? Sure there are, but you don't need 15,000 centrifuges to produce medical isotopes. You don't. And so Iran, we need to hold them accountable to what they've said. There's a fatwa against nuclear weapons. We don't want to have a nuclear weapons program. Okay, we're going to hold you accountable for that. You cannot have nuclear material, equipment, centrifuges consistent with anything other than the most benign and peaceful program. And so those are the two main elements, a dismantling of anything that would even get close to weaponry and a comprehensive inspection regime. And we need to do this, put this publicly on the table, because if these negotiations fail, it needs to be clear to the P5+1 and to the world that they failed because Iran has not been willing to live up to what they've said their intentions are. I'm glad these negotiations are going forward, and they shouldn't fail because it looks like, you know, the U.S. or the P5+1 are moving the goalposts around. We need to make clear that any failure is because of Iran's not being willing to live up to their stated intentions. So those are some of the core elements. But again, one of the worst things that could happen would be for a deal to be struck, and then when it comes back to Congress, for Congress to say no. It would be kind of like Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations coming to Congress after the Treaty of Versailles and saying, look, this is something I've staked my presidency on, and Congress rejecting it. That was a huge rebuke that affected the course of the next 25 years of history in the world. A rebuke of a treaty might have a similar dramatic effect in the United States and elsewhere, and that means taking seriously what the Senate has said, what Congress has said about necessary elements is very important.
Jim, how does this sound, and what else do you think needs to be in the agreement? And you've been at these tables. What do you think the chances are of getting the sort of agreement America needs?
Well, I agree with the Senator that I think the two key dimensions of this are the scale of what's left after the agreement and the transparency verification. I think both are critical. I think that making clear that the scale is only scaled to civilian use, both in the types of equipment, the types of activities, and the amount of it is really critical, because that's part of what provides reassurance, and then the transparency and verification is the key to giving you the warning about breakout. But I think, Rob, the thing that I'd just like to emphasize here is that while the deal is important in itself, I mean, we want to stop the proliferation problem, at some point we've got to start to address the political problem that underlies this. You know, it's important that the P5+1 is doing this, but you know, the other people who care about this are the people in the region, Israel, the Arab neighbors, and at some point there needs to be a piece of this as we begin to move forward with negotiating and then implementing an agreement that gives some reassurance to Iran's neighbors about what Iran is about as well. And so I think we need to begin to think now about how we link this to a broader political process and political strategy that deals with part of the reason we're worried about Iran is not just capabilities but intentions. What kind of vision does Iran have for its role in the region? Is it willing to work and live in peace with its neighbors despite the confessional differences? Is it prepared to be a non-dominant figure that's not trying to bully or coerce others? And that can't fully be addressed simply through the narrow definition of the nuclear negotiations.
I mean, this is in fact an issue of some debate, is at what point should we enlarge the area of negotiations to look at Iran's broader regional behavior? You
know, again, I think that the problem is that if we just look at capabilities, we're always going to be afraid of breakout, hidden programs and the like. And the time we're finally going to feel reassured, if ever, is when we have a sense that Iran's ambitions are not threatening to others.
Jean-David, what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I think that this negotiation is a perfect illustration of my point. Here you have American leadership, but you have the partners in a coalition of a willing. And key partners, Russia, China, and 3 European countries, deeply involved and together really united to reach the goal that we share. Second, in terms of demands to Iran, I would add the Arak plutonium facility. Because if you don't do that, the moment you get fuel in this facility, you cannot destroy it and stop it anymore. Third, to answer your question, Rob, I would say my suspicion is that end of July, there will not be the final deal ready for signature. So you will get 6 more months. End of January, I suspect that you will not get the final deal that you demand. We don't know. And as Tom Donilan said yesterday night, we don't know because the answer is in Tehran. And in Tehran, we don't know what is in the mind of Khamenei and what is the relationship between Khamenei and Rouhani. So the question will be, end of January, what should we do? Probably not stop negotiation, because otherwise, what is left? A breakout towards a bomb, bombing Iran. So the strong push for a continued negotiation until the last day of President Obama will be there. Now, I come to Jim's remark. What is at stake here, it seems to me, goes well beyond the nuclear program of Iran, which is already a major preoccupation. What is at stake is how Iran sees its role in the world, in the region. And here you have a coalition of the willing of the key powers, which may have an impact in the internal debate in Tehran between Rouhani, who hopefully wants to engage and build a better relationship between Iran and the neighbors in the region, and Khamenei, who is supposed to say we need an enemy, America, to maintain the regime as it is. This debate probably is an open debate. So my recommendation at some point in time would be to expand the negotiation process to this very question. And by the way, there is a stalemate in Syria, and we know that this stalemate cannot be solved if you don't have a better coalition, a better understanding between the key regional powers, that is Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. So I'll stop at that.
Okay, let me turn to Elliott. Jean-David went out on a limb and predicted no deal July, no deal January. Elliott, what's your prediction, and what do you think the implications of that will be?
I think the administration is trying very hard to get an agreement now, because if you, they correctly believe that if you leave it for another 6 months and then another 6 months, you know, you're hostage to fate. No one knows what's going to happen in the Middle East and in the world. So I think they would very much like to get some kind of deal now, and they're trying very hard. The problem is, for all the reasons that have been stated, it's not, in my view, it's likely to be a bad deal, and that's going to create all sorts of problems. The first, as has been mentioned, for people in the region, because if we do a deal quickly now, it will not include anything else about Iran's behavior. In Syria, in Lebanon, in Bahrain, in Iraq, subversion, support for terrorism. So what I think certainly the Arabs in the region, the Gulf Arabs, worry about is that a deal, a nuclear deal, which ends or significantly reduces sanctions is going to make Iran richer, and it will have more resources to devote to the bad behavior in which it is now engaged. And then you have the Israelis who are going to be wondering, well, what is this deal? I agree with what's been said about a deal should significantly dismantle the program. They have 19,000 centrifuges. If they're going to have any, and obviously the best number is 0, that number has to come down by something like 90%. And Arak, the plutonium reactor, should be shut. And Fordo, actually, the underground site, should be shut. If we get a deal that says, well, Fordo, you know, they'll just be using it for R&D, and Arak, well, we have some scientific fixes. And the centrifuges, you know, they'll be under verification and inspection. Then you're not doing what the senator asked for, which is dismantling the program. You're relying on our intelligence and on inspections to be able to tell how close they are getting to a nuclear weapon. We have never been able to do that anywhere. We've always failed to do that, and I would just end by reminding you the Syrian nuclear reactor was 90% finished by the time the Israelis discovered it, and the CIA didn't even know it was there. So I'm just not so, I'm not so happy about trusting to fate.
Senator, your view on whether you think the deal will happen by July, and on this issue of broadening the agenda, what do you think?
I don't think it'll happen by July, and I think there will be a decision that we'll have to make. Look, I want to stay at the table. If we're at the table to negotiate the end of this existential threat, I want to stay at the table. The question is, what would we be willing to do if there's not a deal? And that's going to be the harder question for us. Broadening the debate, it's important. You know, in my travels in the region as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, you know, I had an eye-opening experience that I'm sure everybody in this room already knew, but it was eye-opening for me. The Israeli concern about the Iranian weapons program is pretty straightforward. Our security, our existential security. The Gulf state nations' concerns about Iran are much more numerous. Weapons program, sure, but also you have Sunni Shia, you have Arab Persian, you have monarchy versus Revolutionary Guard. You have, well, they've been kind of isolated economically, and that has helped us maybe be a little more successful economically. If they come roaring back into the mainstream economically, Iran is an entrepreneurial and educated culture that can be strong economically. So there's a lot of different concerns among Gulf state allies. And in a way, Elliott, my sense was, if their worry is, what if we get a really good deal? And say it's really good for the United States in ending this program, and it's good for Israel. Will we shake hands with Iran and say, fine, our work is done here. We can ride out of town now. And then all these other issues will not have been addressed. That is, they're almost more worried about a good deal that would cause us to depart than they are worried about a bad deal. And that means that the idea of broadening the dialogue to include more topics, it ultimately has to be done.
So the implications both of a good deal, problematic implications even of a good deal.
We would pray for those problems, but
that's right.
There's never a slam dunk in this life. A good deal would have its own set of challenges.
Speaking of those challenges, I want to turn this discussion just a moment now to an issue related to Iran, because Iran is all in this country, and that's the question of Syria. One doesn't just have to paraphrase Samantha Power, but this is indeed a problem from hell. Here is what the president said about Syria in Manila.
So if you look at Syria, for example, our interest is in helping the Syrian people, but nobody suggests that us being involved in a land war in Syria would necessarily accomplish this goal. And I would note that those who criticize our foreign policy with respect to Syria, they themselves say, no, we don't mean sending in troops. Well, what do you mean? Well, you should be assisting the opposition. Well, we're assisting the opposition. What else do you mean? Well, perhaps you should have taken a strike in Syria to get chemical weapons out of Syria. Well, it turns out we're getting chemical weapons out of Syria without having initiated a strike. So what else are you talking about? And at that point, it kind of trails off.
Jim, first, the definition of our interests, and then how to go about it. What do you think?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about Syria, and there have been different views, as I think widely known, even among some who formerly served in the administration. I mean, I think that we had reached a point in Syria where the issue of the continuation of the Assad regime in the face of what it had done, both regionally and to its own people, was one that did implicate direct interests of the United States. And that I think we made a correct decision that Assad should go, and that we should have pursued that as a part of our strategy. I certainly agree with the president that doesn't necessarily involve U.S. troops, and I don't think it is, again, something that necessarily one can achieve overnight. There's not a magic bullet necessarily. Even a more robust program of providing military support to the opposition wouldn't have guaranteed a result. But I think we need to be clear that that even if we are prepared to have a negotiation about this, that the only result that's an acceptable result of the negotiation is a change of regime in Syria, and one that is tolerant of all the different forces and factions in a now bitterly divided Syria, and one which doesn't pose a threat or isn't allied with some of the contending forces in the region. So while I think we shouldn't rule out the diplomatic route, I think we can only succeed in that if we demonstrate both through word and deed that our commitment is to a new government, a new kind of regime in Syria, which I think is critical to long-term stability both within Syria and outside of Syria.
Jean-David?
Well, first, I think we, all of us, made a mistake at the beginning. That is, we should have rushed into helping, militarily speaking, much more the moderate opposition than we did. That was a mistake. Second mistake, when you have a red line and you are the leader, you have to act. And President Hollande was in a difficult situation because we were ready to strike. And of course, that was not the decision which was taken anyway. Now we are in an impasse, and I agree with Jim's assessment, but what can we do? As we are in an impasse for probably months and months, I would recommend to organize in Geneva a discussion among those in favor of Assad and those against Assad about what should be not the ceasefire, but what should be the future of our own country. You need this discussion. It's today the Syrian Arab Republic. Arab, well, you have a Kurdish minority. Should you keep this word or not? Republic, what does it mean? Does it mean, like in Egypt with Morsi, that the winner takes all and the minorities have no say? Or do you want to guarantee to the minorities a role in the state, in the army, in the police, in the administration, and so on? And this discussion could pave the way to a political solution when the time will come. And second, as I said, at some moment we will need to have a positive involvement, not the negative involvement we have now, a positive involvement of the three regional key actors, two Sunni actors, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and one Shia actor, Iran. Is it totally impossible? I don't think so. But here you need not only American leadership, but this coalition of the willing, which is now doing a fine job with the nuclear Iranian program.
So, Senator, in his remark, the president referred only to a humanitarian interest in that one sentence. Other senior administration officials have actually laid out in some detail strategic interest in Syria. When you and your colleagues look at this, what do you see? And how does that animate whatever willingness you think you and Congress has to support a more assertive action in Syria?
Well, I definitely agree with those who say it's humanitarian, obviously, but there are definite strategic interests directly with respect to the security of the United States and our dear allies. And so that means the strategic interest is there. If it were up to me now, I mean, what I think we should do is we should take advantage of the fact that Russia had to quit blocking Security Council resolutions during the Winter Olympics. You know, for the one time in the UN and in the Security Council, the Winter Olympics, they had to kind of try to be good guys. And so they agreed to a modest, but for the first time they didn't block it, humanitarian resolution on February 22nd, calling for aggressive insertion of humanitarian aid to the 9 million people who need it. Now, the progress since then has been abysmal. But we have a UN Security Council resolution that says there should be aggressive delivery of aid, including cross-border aid. I think without going back to the UN, we should be part of an international coalition. The U.S. should lead it, but with others, to aggressively insert humanitarian aid into that country, into populations that need it. And if Assad or anybody else, ISIS, mess with us in trying to deliver humanitarian aid, then they should pay a cost. And that may change the calculus, but whether or not it changes the calculus, the aggressive delivery of humanitarian aid to people who need it is something that I think my colleagues could support, even those who were going to vote against military force. I think the American public could support. And if we saw the delivery of humanitarian aid in accord with the UN Security Council resolution being blocked by Bashar al-Assad or anybody else, I think we would then be right and supported to make anybody pay who tried to get in our way.
I'm going to clap for that. Elliott, when you look at the Syria debate today, how do you see it evolving? Do you see a tipping point at some point where the policy elite, on the one hand, and the general public may move into a more aggressive, assertive posture, or do you see this debate staying at the sort of low gear, where it's a humanitarian interest, but we're not going to raise it to a level of true action?
I think there has been an evolution among what let's call foreign policy elites, your term. I think, as I talk to both Republicans and Democrats, that there is a sense that, well, what Jean-David said, that you draw a red line, you have to maintain that red line. A sense that we made a mistake in not backing the rebels earlier, although again, who wanted to back the rebels sooner and more? Panetta, Gates, Clinton. They were shot down by the president. And the problem, I think, is not the foreign policy elite, which is, in my view, evolving in the right direction. It's the president. The president's not evolving at all. And you heard him in that brief statement, basically still saying, you know, people want to get us involved in a war. I'm against this. It's just you want to send troops, and people say we should be helping the rebels. We're helping the rebels. That's a disingenuous comment. Come on. The top officials of this administration wanted to do more for the rebels. He said no. We sent people, in essence, out to fight. We said, you're fighting Assad, you're fighting jihadis. That's wonderful. Here are bandages. That's really an amoral or immoral position, I think, for us ever to take. Here are bandages. The gap between the American people, I would say, and the foreign policy elite is significant, because we all know what the polls show. How do you bridge that gap? Well, really only one way, leadership. I come back to that. I think the president could bridge the gap. I think that if the president did really what Senator Kaine is proposing, and then went out and made a few speeches to the American people and said, this is what we're doing for humanitarian and strategic reasons, I think he could persuade a lot of people to get behind it. But he isn't doing it. And as long as he isn't doing it, I see that gap remaining, and I do not expect a change in American policy.
Rob, can I just add one more point? Because I think it's really important to be more explicit, perhaps, than I was first, about what some of the U.S. strategic interests are here. Because I think we have the worst of all worlds in Syria right now. In addition to the humanitarian disaster, which is tragic, as the senator has said, we have a situation in which, from a message to the region, the message is, you know, be brutal, crack down on your own people, and you'll succeed, because nobody's going to do anything about it. But second, in terms of the threats to the United States, the result is it's unlikely, in my judgment, that even if left alone, that Assad will conquer all of the country. So we now have these pockets of Syria that are controlled by our worst enemies, radical groups that threaten us, our friends, Israel, and others, and where Assad actually has very little incentive even to get that under control, because it's part of his narrative about why he needs to stay there. And yet the fear that we've had about sanctuaries, which we've been trying to deal with in other places, in other contexts, is now beginning to emerge in Syria. It's destabilizing the border with Turkey. It's causing problems with the Kurdish population. So I think it is important to be very explicit about the range of interests that are at stake here, and why letting this just fester is really very problematic from an American point of view as well as from the region.
Just to put an exclamation point on that, it was only a couple of weeks ago that the Director of National Intelligence noted that for the first time in a long time, Al-Qaeda is not only back in Syria, and that it is now rightfully viewed as a threat to our homeland. And so, but one can imagine this evolving in a supremely ironic fashion, where the United States begins to take measures against Assad's enemies, namely the jihadists in Syria, as a protection for our homeland.
And we could do it. The authorization for use of military force that was passed on September 14, 2001 would allow us to do it, would allow a president to do it without any action of Congress. But what a bizarre irony that would be, that an AUMF passed 13 years ago with no temporal limitation and no geographic limitation would actually be used in that way. That's a separate issue. I won't get on that soapbox now.
Any idea how this ends? How does this end?
I mean, I'll say the obvious and then let Lem fill in all the details, the smart ones. You have to change the equation enough to make people really want to sit down at a negotiating table and figure out what the end is. Syrian people, Syrian leadership. We were with the Syrian opposition yesterday. They're in, leaders are in, President Jabbar and others are in Washington, and we talked to them on the Foreign Relations Commission, and the Geneva efforts thus far have not been at all successful because the Assad regime kind of thinks they're winning, even though the percentage of territory they're controlling is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, but they're hunkered down in that territory. Unless you change the you have to change the equation so that people feel like they have an interest in ultimately discussing. I think the President and the administration are right. Secretary Kerry is right. This does not have a military solution. It only has a political solution. But military force and other elements, including this humanitarian aid thing, are the kinds of things that have to change the equation for the political settlement, political resolution to kind of mature and be ready for a solution.
Elliott?
I think that's quite right. I think I'm from Virginia. You can see the Virginians here are agreeing on everything. The diplomacy is not going to determine what happens on the ground. What happens on the ground is going to determine the diplomacy. From this point of view, I may disagree with Jean-David. I don't think Geneva will be useful unless and until it's clear that the United States is willing to make the investment to change the facts on the ground. And I think we can still do that. But I think we should realize that one of the things that may happen here, it's happened in other places, is that this terrible war could go on for years more.
And Jim, a war like this that goes on as far as the eye can see, what are the knock-on effects that we will have to begin to deal with?
Again, I think that this is, it affects all of the neighbors. We haven't talked about Jordan, for example, which is of deep concern for the reasons this audience understands well, and the instability that's creating there, the problems that it's creating in Turkey and along the Turkish border, the tensions among the countries in the region that it's stoking. And so it both flows into Syria and flows out of Syria. And that's why I think that we are a bit, failing to see the broader stakes here, even though I think the Senator has laid out the basic framework. That doesn't say it's easy to get here from there, but I think that we have not, I think you have to start from the premise, and that was my first observation, you have to start from the premise that you're serious about Assad going. And then you say, what are all the tools? Diplomatic, economic? I don't think we've exhausted the economic tools to put pressure on the regime. I think we had some strategy early on to try to separate the Sunni elites who have been supporting Assad in the past, but who might think about a future in which they could succeed without him, and how do you get past them? I think there's a range of tools that we know how to do, but you have to work backwards from the proposition that it's not a sufficient, but it's a necessary condition to have this current regime and current leadership to reach out to all of those elements within Syrian society that want to be part of a post-Assad world, and then to think about all the tools of pressure. Some of them military or military related, some of them economic, some of them diplomatic, that makes it clear that the days are numbered, and that for everybody else who wants a future, because Assad will go, that they better jump ship now and get on a different ship to be part of that future rather than be part of the train that's going nowhere with Assad on it.
Jean-David, the final word on this topic?
Yeah, well, first about my debate with Elliott, I would say to get rid of Assad, first, you have to reassure the minorities, especially the Alawites, about their future without Assad. And that's why I think the debate about the institutions of Syria of tomorrow is so important. Second, I fear that the consequences of what's going on slowly is unraveling the borders of the Sykes-Picot Accord of 1916, that is, the borders of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan. Where you see the Kurdish part of Syria joining the Iraqi part, and a kind of Kurdish state slowly emerging. And of course, this is a big problem for Turkey. Second, you may say, well, Iran is very pleased. Well, not anymore if it unravels the existence of Iraq as a state, because today Iraq is under the control of the Shia. And now we see Fallujah and the Anbar province under more and more the control of Al-Qaeda, which is very bad news for the Iranians, and so on and so forth. And that's why I say the regional powers, at the end of the day, should understand that they have an interest in solving the problems.
It sounds horrible, but I'm going to move to another topic because there's so much that I want to get these wise people to address. And I know that Senator Kaine needs to leave a few minutes early. So let me move to a different topic for a moment of special relevance for Senator Kaine's presence here. Arab Spring is not a term we hear too much anymore. We just had at the Institute last week Michael Morell, former CIA acting director, who went on the record and said, this isn't an Arab Spring, this is an Arab winter, and it's been horrible. And one of the implications is that he couldn't find many places where things are that much better than they were 4 years ago. Now, we're about to have an election in Egypt, which was the iconic setting of Tahrir Square, and it is very likely possibility, strong possibility that 4 years after Mubarak, 3 years after Mubarak, a general will get elected president. Now, on the one hand, he's a far cry from the sort of Democrat we all hoped for. On the other hand, he's also a far cry from the Islamist that we got. So, Senator, what should be the American approach to this new change in Egypt? An open hand, continued American military and economic assistance, or a different approach?
Why do I always have to be first on these terms? So first, in terms of examples, look at Tunisia. Pretty good example, some significant challenges, but they just embraced a very significant constitutional reform where the Islamist party in Tunisia embraced a constitution that protects the rights of women, religious freedom. There's a whole series of things. Now, it's not 80 million people like Egypt, but it is an example of some progress that I think is worthy of a U.S. investment and spotlight in terms of what they're doing. You can look at democratic reforms in Morocco, Jordan. There's positive reforms in Jordan in a number of ways. Anyway, so there are some examples. But on Egypt, I was in Egypt in February and talked to government and opposition and journalists and a lot of civil society, and it was very confusing. Everyone agreed the first Tahrir Square was a step toward democracy, and it was deeply split about the second Tahrir Square movement in the summer of 13. Was it an additional step to democracy, or was it a step back toward military anti-democracy? Highly complex. I think the decision to release the Apache helicopters to the government was a smart one. For those of you not following the details, we've withheld a lot of military aid basically after about July or August, after the imprisonment of journalists and a lot of unrest. We withheld a lot of military aid that had been pledged. I think the release of the Apaches was very smart because Egypt does need those Apaches, I believe, to fight against terrorists. There is a legitimate terrorism threat, and we need to support them in their counterterrorism efforts, and the Apaches will be used in that, and there isn't a likely malign use of the Apaches. Some of the other military aid could be used in a malign way. And so while this election process is taking place, and we all would expect that General al-Sisi will be victorious, we need to continue to have the dialogue about these remaining military assets, and likely during the course of a campaign, there's not going to be a big pledge about we will do X, Y, or Z, but hopefully shortly after a campaign, there will be commitments with respect to civil society, the imprisonment of journalists. You can't, just because you have a terrorism threat, you can't label every political opponent a terrorist. Not every political opponent is connected with terrorists, and there's too much of that broad brush going on in Egypt. So I'm glad we released the Apaches, the remaining military aid. This has been an important relationship for the United States, a very important one. We want it to continue to be close and important, but we have to keep in dialogue to hope that the newly formed government, once elected, will take some significant steps towards restoration of basic civil and human rights. And I do have to now go vote on a Mother's Day resolution or something. I don't know what it is. So I should probably go, and I'll let you guys all continue. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Get the photo.
Elliott, are the Virginians going to agree on whether or not we should continue military aid to the new government in Egypt?
I think that's a very difficult question. Bernard Lewis, the great historian, once said that there's two kinds of countries in the Middle East. There's countries where the people think that we oppose a dictatorial regime like Iran, and they love America. And there's countries where they think we support a dictatorial regime, and they hate us. And his example was Egypt. We spent too much time backing Hosni Mubarak under the theory that this would bring stability. But in the end, of course, it didn't. And then we were very nice to the SCAF. And then we were very nice to Mohamed Morsi. Why? Stability. I think we have to give General Sisi a chance. But if he decides to label, look, remember the election was 50-50, Morsi, Shafiq. If he decides to label the 20, 30, who knows, percent of Egyptians who are against him as terrorists, if he continues to jail opponents and journalists, that's not a formula for stability. He's very unlikely, I think, to produce an economic miracle. In fact, in the period since the overthrow of Mubarak, the economic role of the army has expanded. It is possible to have an economic miracle under a military regime. I mean, it happened in South Korea, it happened in Chile, happened in Taiwan. But in those cases, the army didn't own about a third or a half of the economy. So if, as a general, he opposes economic reforms, you're going to have a crummy economic situation and a repressive government that's not a formula for stability. I would like us to maintain a certain degree of distance. So I think the Apache decision was right. I think we need to talk to them about reducing and reconforming the military aid, because they don't need F-16s. Tom Lantos, I'll stop with this. The late Tom Lantos once said to me when I was testifying in favor of aid to Egypt years ago, Elliott, do you think that Egypt needs more tanks or more schools? I think we know the answer to that.
Jim, dealing with change in Egypt was a huge issue when you were in the State Department as Deputy Secretary. How would you approach this next phase of change?
Well, just to go back to some of our earlier history, New York and Virginia worked together to put the Bill of Rights into the Constitution. So New York wants to agree with our most recent Virginian thing, because I do think it's important to recognize that. I mean, first of all, I think we have very, very limited impact on the decisions that the Army is making and the military is making in Egypt right now. They're making their own existential calculations about how they see their interests, and whether we provide Apaches or don't provide Apaches or military equipment. I don't think that's going to have a big impact on the near-term decisions that they make. Now, that's bad in the sense that it means that our instinct to try to make what we want to happen is not going to happen. But I also think it does give us a bit of flexibility, because since we're not going to have an impact one way or the other in the short term, or much of an impact, I think we can play for the longer game here. And that's where I agree with Elliott, because I do think there is a longer game here. And with all due respect to Mike Morrell, who I have the greatest admiration for, this is a long-term game. I say this with some trepidation with Jean-David sitting next to me, but there's that famous warhorse about Zhou Enlai being asked what he thought about the French Revolution, and his response was, "It's too soon to say." And I think this is a long-term project here, that we have to understand that while we have to treat each country under its unique and individual circumstances, that the big game here is ultimately the engagement of these publics in these countries, because we won't get long-term stability without that. It is a process which will happen. Technology and the economics are all going to drive that eventually, and so we have to position us for this. And I think a number of the things that the military is doing in Egypt are absolutely unacceptable by any definition of how we define who we are as a people. And I don't think we can simply say, well, it's a difficult situation, it's complicated, et cetera. I mean, I think we need to be very clear about that, and I think we do have to be cautious about our engagement here. And I think we need to make clear that but we have to tell everyone, including the American people, that the fact that whether we go forward or withhold may not make a difference, but here's what we're playing for in the long run, and here's why we are working for this. And I think it goes back to the Senator's early point, which is why it's so important for us to work effectively with the countries that are taking the right steps, to say when you do it, the United States is there and helping, and we're behind you in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Jordan, and work in all of the countries of the region, in the Gulf as well, to begin to say, here's the opportunity that comes as you make steps, not to assume or to count on the Egyptian military to take decisions, but simply say when countries do, the United States is there to be supportive.
And just as a point of information, Jean-David, when you looked at the events of June 30th and July 4th, when the people of Egypt and then the military of Egypt overthrew Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood leadership in Egypt, was this a welcome development, or was this a troubling, problematic development?
I have to ask whether it was a coup also.
Yeah, well, the problem with revolutions is that first it takes time, as it was said, before the situation settles. For France, it was 100 years. So we are only at the beginning of these long processes. Second, some evolutions are, as it was said, very encouraging. Tunisia, but also Morocco, Jordan. We have to have a close look to what is going on in Libya, and we should do more to help the Libyan leadership, for what is left of the leadership. Now, to answer your question, Morsi made so many mistakes that it didn't come as a surprise. At least this was not a surprise. I agree with what was said before, so I will not repeat it. I will just add maybe one little note. We should maybe engage in dialogue with Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others, because they are paying and giving so much money to Egypt, to the Egyptian military leadership, that our capacity to impose our views or influence the events is radically diminished. And so it seems to me that it is in the interest of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and others to make sure that Egypt is a success story. And there we can work together. And through this dialogue, maybe we could also convince them that the slow evolution which is taking place in Saudi Arabia could take inspiration maybe in Morocco or maybe in Jordan. So I would spread this dialogue to the whole region.
Okay, more dialogue. Let's turn to a country that has come up only in passing in this conversation so far, and that's Israel. It was mentioned briefly in the Iran discussion, briefly as because of the impact of the Syria discussion, but not in and of itself. The main headlines in America on Israel recently were about the peace process, which regrettably seems to be at an impasse. Now, without litigating the wisdom of the investment that was made in that diplomacy over the last year, so where do we go from here? And what should be the principal focus of U.S.-Israel relations in the period ahead? Jim?
Hey, Rob, you always save the best for last. This is obviously an enormous challenge, but I think that, I come away with this from a kind of a reconfirmation of a lesson which I've always believed, which is that I do think while the United States can play an important role as a facilitator, that we learn time and time again that ultimately progress really requires the direct engagement between the two parties, and if and when they're not ready to do that, we don't make progress, and in the circumstances when they can see the benefits for themselves of doing it. So I think we need to get back from that basic perspective to start with the little stuff, as it were, to get back to the kinds of specific and concrete things that can be done on the ground that reflect the, at least avowed principle of both sides, which is to still believe in a two-state solution, and to take steps that can do it from the ground up. This obviously has a lot of resonance and very much debated in the region and the consequences of that. And I would not want my view of that to be said that I don't believe that there isn't a need ultimately for a top-down agreement. But I think that right now, with the formal process once again in abeyance, it's all the more important that the kind of the little steps, the confidence building, the sense of belief in a better final resolution of this conflict allows to go forward, and that we begin to deal with the things that make it possible to imagine an economically viable Palestinian entity that deals with the security issues that Israel needs to face on just the kind of day-to-day decisions in terms of what's going on in the West Bank, how are day-to-day operations, how is the Israeli military and other forces operating, how do the two communities interact with each other, and to at least take steps now to not further exacerbate the sense of disappointment, distrust that comes out of when we reach this point of negotiations.
Elliott, what do you think?
I think the same. I think that if we've had 3 presidents in a row now of both parties who essentially went for the comprehensive agreement and concentrated mostly on getting that rather than the kind of ground-up improvement of which Jim speaks. Had we, over these, let's say, 20, 25 years, had we been working on the more pragmatic improvements in life and governance, particularly in the West Bank, I think actually we and they would be closer to peace. So I think that was a missed opportunity, and I think, as Jim does, that it's an opportunity that still exists. We should, I think, turn our attention this way. There has been some progress. Prime Minister Netanyahu has actually been quite interested in the question of improving the Palestinian or West Bank economy. There's a lot more, I think, that could be done there that would be beneficial. And as Jim says, it's not that you announce, okay, negotiations are over, forget that. It's rather where you dedicate more of your energy.
So, Jean-David, how would you imagine the repercussions of impasse in diplomacy? How would that factor into French and more broadly European approach to Israel and this issue?
Okay, well, first, I'm a great admirer of the efforts of Secretary Kerry. Really, it's amazing to see how dedicated, ambitious he was, and he was right. Second, I agree with what was said by Jim and Elliott. I would like to just add one idea. The Palestinians have decided once more to have a unity government between the Fatah and Hamas. And they have decided, they have announced that there would be elections. Well, let's take them at their word. And I understand that for the US, you have to suspend financial aid because that's the law. But why shouldn't we, all of us, encourage all the Palestinians to go to free and fair elections in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip? And why shouldn't we encourage all the Arab countries around who are so much against the Muslim Brothers? Number one, Egypt, neighbor of Gaza, but also Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, to join forces with us to push for really free and fair elections in both the West Bank and in Gaza. I'm pretty sure that if this can be achieved, then you will have a Fatah majority not only in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. And then a new situation would emerge, because the Israeli government would have in front of him a united, moderate government for the Palestinian people. And this could be a golden opportunity to push back for a new round of negotiations.
Can I just, it pains me slightly to not fully agree with my good friend Jean-David, but I worry about having elections in this context. I mean, it sounds, having just done a pay into democracy and what we should be believing in here, to not be full-throatedly enthusiastic. But the problem with free and fair in this context is, I mean, it could be easily technically free and fair in the sense that, you know, we would have observers and the like. But I worry in the shadow of the breakdown of the negotiations, whether the thing would be about standing up for a position, you know, by goodness, we're going to show Israel, you know, that what we're all about. And I don't know whether it's possible to have, I mean, I believe deeply that your instinct is right, that the majority of the Palestinian people want a moderate government that can live with Israel and all that stuff. But in the right now, in the context of the current environment, I don't have the same confidence. And I think that the problem, and we've seen this in the past, and we had a lot of confidence what was going to happen the last time there was an election. It didn't turn out quite the way I think people hoped it would. So I think that we need to be at least sensitive to the fact that over the long term, of course, elections are something we absolutely should want, but we have to think about the context.
Elliott?
Terrorist groups should not be permitted to join in elections until they lay down their arms. This was a mistake that we in the Bush administration made in 2006. We had a theory that was ultimately evolved through the quartet that, well, Hamas could run and then, of course, they would lose. So one does have to watch out for that. But then they would begin the process of laying down their arms. And of course, they refused to do that. And it's very clear that they continue to refuse to do that. This is not just a matter of Hamas and Fatah and Israel. The IRA was permitted to join in the political process when it agreed to lay down its arms. We had this problem in Kosovo. We're going to have it in a lot of places around the world. It is not fair to allow one party in an election to be armed to the teeth. So I think they should have elections, maybe local elections first, parliamentary elections, but Hamas should not be permitted to participate in those elections as a violent terrorist group.
Okay. Friends, we're coming near to the close of this discussion. So I want to ask our panelists one final question. You get the call. The president says, please come to the Oval Office, Jim, Jean-David, even Elliott.
You're speaking about President Hollande, I assume.
And he says, what's your best idea? You have a few minutes with the president. What do you tell him? Elliott, the most absurd example of this. Elliott.
The problem is, of course, that I would be telling him things that have been said plenty of times in public and not really accepted. I think the main thing to say would be our friends and enemies in the Middle East now are not afraid of the United States and have no confidence on the positive side, no confidence in American power and the old American near hegemony in the Middle East. And my suggestion to him would be, probably in the context of Syria, you need to do something that confirms for friends and enemies, not just the power of the United States, I understand that, but your willingness to act, to use that power to protect American interests and American friends. Once you do that, many more doors will open.
Okay. Jim, president calls. What do you say?
I fear I'm sounding like a one-note Johnny in this, but I think that I would like to see the president in close consultation with key allies, especially France and the countries in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and others, to develop a strategy with an endpoint in Syria. Recognizing that, again, it won't happen overnight, but that I think that in terms of restoring confidence and credibility, we need a common view. It's not something the United States can do alone. But I think everyone shares this sense about the cost of allowing this to fester. And I think we should say, here's what we're going for. Here's the endpoint that we're going to try to achieve. And here are all of us putting all of our tools on the table as a high priority for all of us to get to this point. And I think that very demonstration of resolve and intent, I think could help change the dynamic even within Syria itself. It's not enough by itself, but I think that's what people are looking for, is a sense that we have enough of a stake in this problem that we are going to drive it to conclusion. It may be a month, it may be a year, but this is the place we're going, this is where we want to end up, and all of us together, our European allies, our regional allies, are going to be part of this process that brings it home.
And Jean-David, the president even calls up a Frenchman.
I'm very flattered. I would say we need American leadership in the world, in the Middle East especially. We have American leadership with the negotiation on Iran. you should not only continue this negotiation, but expand it and have a broad strategy because you can have a transforming effect, not only for Iran and the regional powers, but also for the situation in Syria, but also for the peace process. With Senator Kerry, you have started. Please continue. Don't give up. And to my friend Jim, I would say it's difficult for, and Elliott, it's difficult for democracies to be against elections. And it's difficult to be against elections with Hamas because they have used your proposal and they won through elections. But what is important, and that's my answer to Jim, is that the President of the United States shows the way forward in the Middle East peace process too. That is, if you want to succeed despite the climate today between the Israeli and the Palestinians, it's very important that there is a perspective of success for the peace process, and only America can show what is the rising sun over the horizon. And if you can have elections between Fatah and Hamas in this context with a vision of what should be the next steps, then I'm confident that Hamas will lose, especially with the help of Arab countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others. So I'll stop at that. My plea is American leadership.
So, friends, thank you. You know, I didn't plant it this way, but the two key words that did emerge were leadership and strategy. One without the other doesn't work. Only both together get you where you want to go. With that, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Thank you.